So it's my pleasure on behalf of the Wilson Center to introduce Dr. Jessica Symes, who is an Assistant Professor of Sociology at Boston University. Her research examines the consequences of mass incarceration for communities and neighborhoods in the United States, with a focus on racial inequality and health disparities. Her work has been widely published in academic journals such as Science Advances and public media outlets such as The Atlantic. Her research has been supported by awards from the National Science Foundation, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Arnold Ventures, and more. Today, she will discuss her new book, Punishing Places, the Geography of Mass Incarceration. And now I'll turn it over to Jessica, who will speak about the book, and then the Q&A will follow. So please welcome me in joining. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jessica Symes.
Thank you so much, Kevin. It's such an honor to be here today. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides and get started. I know that any information about the historical trajectory of mass incarceration, but I like to start here just to get us thinking about why we would want to take a community level approach to thinking about the causes and consequences of mass imprisonment. So in the late 20th century, the United States embarked on an experiment in crime control policy that was globally unique and historically unprecedented. And after several decades of stability in the early 20th century up to 1970, the rate of incarceration more than quadrupled. By 2012, the incarceration rate was about 700 per 100,000, with a total of 2.23 million people in custody. And so around that time, about 1 in every 3 adults had felony records, and demographers think this amounts to about 70 to 100 million people. A second sort of defining feature of the American system of punishment is its racial disparity. Of the over 2 million people behind bars, 60% are people of color. And for African-American men born in 2001, the lifetime risk of imprisonment is 1 in 3. And for those who dropped out of high school, nearly 70% have prison records and are more likely to be incarcerated than employed in the labor market. So these two facets of the US criminal justice system, its scale and its large racial disparity, have led to what scholars have termed mass imprisonment, where, as David Garland says, imprisonment ceases to be the incarceration of individual offenders and becomes the systematic imprisonment of whole groups of the population. So the book begins with this premise that punishment, while premised on the individual, in the United States is at least in the United States is directed at a community. But social science rarely accounts for the community level exposures to incarceration. And our policy reforms overwhelmingly focus on individuals and not their broader network or community. Second, those that have studied community level rates of imprisonment and their effects have mainly examined large urban cities, especially New York and Chicago. And studies may have missed important spatial and temporal trends in the imprisonment rate, and also important mechanisms that link place and punishment and how those might differ across urban, suburban, and rural contexts. So my goals are to investigate community level exposures and disparities to mass incarceration by race and ethnicity, and also study the spatial context of imprisonment across the urban-rural continuum. So I'm going to start with my main arguments, and then I'm going to share some findings from the book and end with a discussion of some of the policy implications of this analysis. So my main arguments are threefold. One is that mass imprisonment is a broad mode of governance affecting communities across the US urban-rural continuum, and that this is historically new. Second, that mass imprisonment follows the spatial and contextual contours of racial segregation, similar to poverty and violence. And finally, an analysis of the community level conditions points to a broader understanding of the political and social costs of mass imprisonment, and also what we should do to remedy them. So the key findings I'm going to share today are kind of mapping onto these three arguments. First, I identify a very broad spatial pattern of mass imprisonment affecting really small cities and small counties across the US. I also identify that even though the spatial context of mass incarceration has been changing and has been diffusing across space, there remains very, very strong correlations between race and incarceration, and in particular, something I call communities of pervasive incarceration. I also tried to come up with different ways of measuring and capturing the large social and political effects of mass imprisonment. So I wanted to share that in the Q&A, I'm happy to share some background about my work in Massachusetts and the background on sort of what that state is, why that state's an important one for looking at mass imprisonment, and also tell you more about the data if you're curious about how I kind of got to these different findings. But I'm going to sort of zoom through so we can get to the discussion. So first, the main findings around space are around small cities and rural and suburban communities. So what I find is that today, mass imprisonment, the rates of incarceration are highest in small cities, suburbs, and rural communities. And this is actually historically new, and with a shift occurring in Massachusetts in the early 2000s and nationally in 2010. So here is a map of Massachusetts. You can see that small cities in the sort of outer regions of the state in Western Massachusetts and along the Cape have the highest rates of incarceration, higher than Boston. And this is a sort of time trend plot of both jail and prison admissions for all US counties. And you can see that for many, many decades, the incarceration rates in large urban counties were much higher than in all non-urban counties. And then around the early mid 2000s, there was a shift, a almost universal shift in urban to non-urban rates of jail incarceration. And much more recently in 2010, we see a divergence and a decline in the large urban cities and a persistence in the smaller counties in the US. So I look at this in two different ways, quantitatively and qualitatively. And quantitatively, I find that models examining the spatial context of imprisonment point to these sort of historically understood factors, but how that might be changing across place. So residential segregation, concentrated disadvantage, criminalized violence, the presence of police, and also this sort of regional heterogeneity. And I offer several sort of explanations for why I think there's this persistence or even growth in incarceration in small cities. My second piece is qualitative, where I interview people who are sort of on the front lines of mass incarceration, social workers who work directly in reentry services, and they really describe a landscape of policy neglect and stigma, extreme and persistent joblessness, a spatial mismatch between services and the people in most need, and really harsh police and prosecutors, and kind of having to mitigate the harshness that their clients experience in the criminal justice system. So a second set of findings kind of deals with this other piece, which is even though the spatial pattern is broadening to other places, there's still a great deal of concentration, particularly as it pertains to race. So one question I'm having here is, to what extent is mass incarceration as a community level exposure uniquely tied to racial segregation? And this is coming from really a Du Boisian perspective of whether or not it makes sense to compare the experiences within white communities and the experiences within Black communities. And Du Bois and several scholars thereafter have sort of made the point that these communities are so fundamentally structured in a way that before we even get to look at things like poverty or violence or incarceration, in my case, race has already done so much of the work to sort of explain the differences in life chances. And so I actually compare the disparity in these three areas. So scholars have looked at the relationship between race, space, and violence. And what I find is that on average, Black and Latino neighborhoods have a reported violent crime rate of 50 to 60% higher than in white neighborhoods. When I look at poverty, it's much higher. So Black neighborhoods in Massachusetts on average are 2.5 times the poverty rate of white neighborhoods. But the greatest disparities I observe are actually in incarceration, where I find that for both Black and Latino neighborhoods, the rate of incarceration is 4.5 times that of an average white neighborhood. So this is kind of building on work from other sociologists who are sort of saying, that race is really structuring so many of the life chances and experiences within neighborhoods that trying to draw comparisons or explanations across white, Black, and Latino neighborhoods is going to be a methodological challenge. And so in this chapter, I don't really do any modeling. I sort of explore a bunch of descriptive ways of looking at race and incarceration. So I wanted to take you sort of through a tour of Massachusetts cities, and you can kind of see here again, this really deeply entrenched racial spatial pattern of incarceration, where for the non-Hispanic Black population, there's a deep core of concentration in Boston's historically Black neighborhoods, whereas whites and even Latinos in the greater Boston area do not experience these sort of intense levels of concentration. This is a smaller city in Massachusetts, Springfield, and it's to the north of Springfield, it's suburb Holyoke. You can see again this sort of diffuse pattern for whites and these sort of more concentrated patterns for Latinos and Black people. In the northern region of the state, there's a small city called Lawrence, which has very, very high rates of incarceration among Latinos. So you see again here a more diffuse pattern among other groups, and Latinos experience this sort of concentrated incarceration. So this is actually a town called Fall River, which is just at the beginning of the Cape in Massachusetts. And it's sort of an exception to the rule, where whites are actually living in very high rates of incarceration in that area, unlike other populations. And it has one of the highest incarceration rates as a town in the state. So another way I look at this is a concept of disproportionality. And all this is a simple ratio that I calculate the percentage of people in a particular racial group at a particular event, for example, whether or not they were imprisoned, and compare that to the percentage of that same racial group in the overall population. So you could say if there is 10% of that population is incarcerated from that area and 10% of the population is that racial group, we would say that's proportional. If 50% of the incarcerated people from that area are of a group and they're only 10%, we would call that overrepresentation. So a ratio of 1-to-1 would suggest a system that is perhaps imprisoning people independently of race. And so I'm plotting the rates of Black disproportionality against rates of white disproportionality. You can see here that the 90th percentile for Black disproportionality is 34, meaning that Black people in that neighborhood or above are 34 times more likely to be incarcerated than a member of that neighborhood. The 90th percentile for white population is 1.2, meaning that basically along the entire distribution of white population, they experience at least proportional incarceration. This is what it looks like for Latinos. The 90th percentile for Latinos is 17 compared to 1.2 for white people. So in other words, disproportionality is the fundamental reality for Black and Latino residents of neighborhoods in Massachusetts. And for whites, disproportionality is the rare exception, even in a statewide analysis that includes that town of Fall River that I was telling you about. The median level of disproportionality for Black people is 14.4, which is 12 times the 90th percentile for whites. And these results suggest that in the case of imprisonment, research on racial disparities should employ local measures to avoid underestimating racial inequality, because statewide Black disproportionality is 2.9 and Latino disproportionality is 2.7. So I look at this at the county level as well. You can sort of see a quite similar pattern, but I'll just break this down in words to get us, I wanna make sure I get to the policy implications. So on average, and accepting outliers in the whole US, sort of in a sample of US counties, white populations are never overrepresented in prison populations and Black populations are never underrepresented. So I just look at this marker of sort of 2, like, are you 2 times more likely to be incarcerated than in the population? And I find 3 counties out of 3,000, a little more than 3,000, where white imprisonment is overrepresented in relation to white population by a factor of 2 or more. I find 80 counties where Latinos are imprisoned 2 times or more their population share. And I find 1,208 counties where imprisonment among Black people is 2 times or more their population share. So I'm gonna sort of run through a little bit quickly this final set of findings that I think dovetails nicely into a discussion about policy reform and policy recommendations. So we know that incarceration itself, putting someone in jail or prison, is a fundamentally segregative act. It changes the composition and membership of communities and neighborhoods, and it can interrupt community bonds and connections to place. So I've come up with this concept of community loss as a way to reframe community level impacts of incarceration. So rather than mapping the incarceration rate, here is a map of the number of years that people were sentenced to prison per capita in each city in Massachusetts. So what this is saying in the darkest sort of shading, that that city experienced 750 years of loss for every 10,000 residents. Put another way, Massachusetts sentenced people to a minimum. So I looked at everyone's minimum sentence. They had to serve at least that much, 127,000 years. Just between 1997 and 2009, which is when mass incarceration peaked in Massachusetts. Boston lost about 487 years for every 10,000 residents, which amounted to about 29,000 years. And small cities tended to have the greatest amounts of loss, 600 to 1,000 years for every 10,000 residents. And this is very spatially concentrated, much like population. 8 cities covering about 1/5 of Massachusetts population accounted for over half of the total experience of community loss. So I wanted to share some final thoughts about what these findings tell us about sort of broader empirical and policy implications. So just to summarize, mass imprisonment today affects a broad range of communities, not just large cities. That racial residential segregation underlies the demographic concentration of punishment, though this is rarely theorized or studied as an important driver of the disparities in imprisonment. I want to point to, though, recent work by Monica Bell at Yale, who argues that criminal justice practices and racial segregation may be mutually reinforcing. And this is, I think, an important avenue for our research in the future. And finally, mass imprisonment will have long-term effects on the quality of membership and the health of communities in American society. If we really take seriously all of this loss, we have to think about what it means to lose this much time for families, for our labor force, for our education systems. This is a great deal of loss experienced by communities. So some empirical contributions are that national or state level analyses really obscure the localized experience of mass imprisonment. And it's important for us to really try to go out and get multi-level data and also take a broad spatial approach looking beyond cities to really capture inequality in imprisonment. I think we also need to explore measures that go beyond counting people and examine the cost of mass imprisonment to our civic infrastructure and the health of communities. And we also should start to think about the carceral state study population as beyond those directly impacted by incarceration. Some policy implications for reform. I think one way to sort of take the findings about race are that racial disparities should really be contextualized as cumulative and contextual over the course of all criminal justice contact. And that begins with the policing and patrolling of neighborhood environments, and maybe even before that. And so policy reform has really focused on individual level interventions at single stages of the criminal justice process to reduce bias among system actors. But eliminating bias of individual actors might have little impact on the overall racial disparities in the system. I also sort of conclude with some ideas around transformative forms of community-based justice. We could conceptualize mass imprisonment as a state-sponsored injustice. Other scholars have referred to this as a malign neglect, that we understood that these policies would have extreme harms that would permeate through generations, and that those harms are now emanating beyond the individuals incarcerated to affect their children, their spouses, their partners, their family members, their community. And I've thought a little bit about what it would mean to consider mass imprisonment as state-sponsored injustice and how reparative justice models might be necessary, and which requires a cessation and a promise of non-repetition, that we will not continue the harms of mass imprisonment. And I point to some community-based justice models that serve as potential pathways to reimagine justice, such as local restorative justice community centers, and also local reparative justice efforts that are going on across the country. So that's all I have for now. I know I'm a bit over time, but thank you all, and I'm happy to answer questions and expand upon these findings in the Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. That was a wonderful talk. We can now open it up for Q&A. I see we have a few questions in chat. The first one coming from Carmen. If you'd like to unmute, Carmen, or if you want, I could read it out loud. It's up to you.
Sure, I'll go ahead. Thanks for your talk, Jessica. My question was just a quick one on, I'll have others, but I'll just get this one out of the way. I really enjoyed your talk. I just wanted to clarify, you talked a lot about like Black and Latinx neighborhoods and their ratios and disparities in incarceration and punishment. I was just wondering how you define those neighborhoods, like what was the threshold for what makes a predominantly Black or Latino neighborhood?
Sure, it was very, very simple, just 50% or more of each group. So if you were a majority, essentially Black, Latinx, or white neighborhood. In my book, I actually break down white a little bit because there are so many majority white neighborhoods in Massachusetts. So I actually look at like sort of a 90th percentile as well, sort of extremely white neighborhoods. And there's only a handful actually of majority Latino and Black neighborhoods in Massachusetts. So it's a that's the cutoff I've chosen, just to make sure I have as many of a sample, but I also model it continuously, where it's just as the percentage, the share of the population increases, things like that. But when I define it as a Black neighborhood, it's 50% or more. Thank you for your question.
If you don't mind, can I just follow up also on your definition of neighborhood? It sounds like, I know you talked about counties and you talked a little bit, you showed us some like city level stuff. Is that what you mean by neighborhood? Is the city, or?
I use the census tract when I actually analyze neighborhoods, and I look at spatial areas that are smaller than a state for other measures. So for example, to have a national sample of places, it's just impossible to gather data on incarceration any level lower than a county, unfortunately, at the moment. So I try to sort of contextualize these neighborhood level findings at the census tract within sort of the best spatial measure we have, but it's certainly imperfect and is missing all of that interesting, like kind of localized variation that I'm finding in Massachusetts.
Thank you.
Yeah, great questions. Thank you.
So I think our next two questions are from Jeff.
Yeah, this is Jeff. So the first one really has to do with thinking about, your pivot from individuals to thinking about communities in these disparities and calculation of disproportionality. But I was wondering too about just sort of the institutions and where the prisons are located and local economies that revolve around prisons and how that might affect the spatial patterns that you're describing. And that was one question. And the other one has to do with sort of how you think about the denominator in calculating disproportionality or disparity, depending on how you define that. And we've done some work around that, where you start with the whole population and then you work down to different denominators, and the disparity index tends to decline as you get to affected populations, such as people in poverty or people who share other risk factors. I have another question too, but I'll just stop right there with those two.
Those are great questions. Thank you, Jeff. There's some amazing work from a scholar named John Eason at Wisconsin, who's specifically looked at how prison sightings have affected the sort of pattern of imprisonment. And I think that's some of his more recent work. What he's really focused on in his work has been how the sort of prison local economy has affected the growth of prisons as a built environment. But I think he's doing some new work that's also trying to argue that this is part of the explanation for the growth of imprisonment in small cities. So I would really look to his work. I find that what I'm finding is more around small cities. So not really these like sort of rural prison communities, but small cities all over the US. I mean, we're all probably from different places, but they're like sort of formerly, they had some kind of industry, some kind of work, and it's disappeared. And there's a great deal of joblessness and poverty and a sort of remaining very punitive criminal justice system. And so I've more so found that it's not really, I haven't personally seen this like direct relationship, but I know that that's what John Eason is working on, and I'd be excited to see what he finds. The second question, so because I'm using total population denominators, it's arguable that my results are quite conservative. And that if I used a more specific population denominator, like even just adults or adults living in a certain socioeconomic gradient, these disproportionality numbers would go through the roof. And so I tried to, and I still think they're quite shocking and quite powerful, even as a general population denominator. And I think I mostly just wanted to go for simplicity, to give people just a real sense that this is the number of people who are imprisoned, and we tend to use total population denominators for our rates. And so I'm going to use that in these measures. I didn't get a chance because of time, but I look at kind of measures of disparity versus disproportionality. I try to explore a lot of different ways of conceptualizing this. And so in many ways, I think my measures are quite conservative. You should feel free to ask your third question too, if you'd like.
Well, thank you. Well, let me just follow up there. That's interesting that you said that you think it's conservative to look at the whole population. Our work, the context of doing a similar analysis, was looking at racial disparities in involuntary outpatient commitment in New York. And there, where you start with the whole population, it's like about a 7-to-1, disparity ratio, Black versus white. But if you move to, say, people who are in the public sector mental health system, people who have a history of involuntary commitment to a hospital, so you're sorting people out along this index, you get to a population that already tends to be sorted by race because of the correlation between race and poverty and other things. So by the time you get down to that population who are more eligible, there is very little difference in the sense that the individual actor there saying you get this mandate and you don't, they could have a blindfold on, you still reproduce the same racial composition in that population. So maybe you're thinking about it a little bit differently, but in that example, really the racial disparity tends to, quote, go away as you sort to this more relevant population. So that was just sort of interesting. And the third question really is what you said at the end about individual actors versus systemic, factors upstream. And I think there's kind of a controversy around talking about it that way, because if you say, well, it's not the individual actors, there is, one set of critics will say, well, you don't want to exculpate these individual actors by saying it's just in the system, this abstract system upstream. Now, on the other hand, you do need to point to these systemic factors, but they tend to be abstractions rather than thinking about individual decision makers. And so there's some controversy around how you talk about it that way. And I wondered if you could respond.
Oh, I think that it's not in favor of dealing with individual actors, but rather putting some real structure, some real specificity around how we could imagine an actual structural level remedy. But I think that we need both, and we tend to focus a lot on these sort of not just individual actors, but also individual stages. Like if we just fix prosecutors or if we just fix the police, the system will improve. And my work is trying to sort of draw a through line from the neighborhood all the way to the prison cell and sort of say, well, all of these factors are valuable and have implications for people's lives and life chances. And we tend to sort of zero in as a discipline, as a field, on one particular area. And so how could we imagine sort of something more comprehensive, and also that these effects emanate beyond the individual? As one example, I'm working on a paper right now that looks at how sentencing reform reduced incarceration and had spillover effects for prenatal care at the community level. And that's just, I don't think that those folks, the people who work on prenatal care and the people who work on sentencing reform, are ever in the same room. And so could it be sort of transformative for us to explore what it would mean to think more systemically about how changes in our sentencing practices could actually affect our healthcare systems in pretty profound ways?
Thank you.
Carissa?
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a fascinating talk. I wanted to ask you a question about one of the early slides that you put up, where you showed the divergence in incarceration rates for large urban areas as compared to the small cities and the rural areas. Because I'm curious, I saw an early chapter of your book where you talked about some possible explanations of this, whether it was demographic changes as more people of color and poorer people moved out of the cities into these other communities. Also the availability of social services in those cities as compared to these other areas. And then also the explanation that I'm most interested in because of my own research, the sort of the policy preferences of those actors in the criminal justice system in larger areas as opposed to these sort of lower population areas. And I was curious, as you look at that slide, does it appear to you that that the change seems to be a change in the urban communities, and that they seem to be taking a less punitive approach, sort of no longer sort of following the increased incarceration rate trajectory that we've seen for so many decades at this point, and we just see the smaller communities continuing on that trajectory? So I guess the question is, should we be looking for a story of reform in some areas and contrasting that with a lack of reform and a continuation of policies from the 80s and 90s in these other areas? Or is there something else going on? And then I guess, and to follow on to that question too, the geographic movement that you talk about, I'm not familiar with Massachusetts. Do you know approximately when that occurred, so I can just better contextualize that chart?
Absolutely. Those are great questions. So that, yeah, there is a part of this chapter where I kind of outline like, 4 or maybe 3 or 4 major explanations for this divergence. I think one is that, and it's so nascent and so politically precarious, but there are discussions of reform going on among large city urban leaders. Things like, closing Rikers was on the table, a lot of progressive prosecutors are being elected into roles in places like Boston and New York City, discussions of bail reform. And so cities are kind of at the forefront of, large cities are at the forefront of kind of reform discussions, especially in light of 2020, there was a lot of sort of political movement towards a more progressive policing and courts in general. And so I think that is part of the story. I think if you look and sort of see it's urban counties are declining, the rates are declining. It's not just that, all of a sudden these places are shooting up. So I think there is some kind of reform going on, and that divergence is largely due to some of the sort of changes around both policing and court processing going on in these larger cities. And yeah, I think if I were to sort of formalize this, right, I would have maybe, use data science to sort of explore the typologies, because there's not a really satisfying explanation that includes both the South and the West and the Midwest and the Northeast. There's some real regional variation about when this has all been happening. I kind of break apart the different regions as well in that chapter. But I think another explanation is definitely this sort of move, the great inversion of cities becoming gentrified and pushing populations that have been historically, marginalized in these cities, but out into poor suburbs. And in Boston, that is certainly the case and has been the case, I would say, since the late 90s, early 2000s, especially. And that's kind of when you see this divergence again. And so these new populations are moving to places that are no longer, sanctuary communities for undocumented people. There's a real enforcement and kind of control perspective on things like the opioid epidemic. You can read local newspapers and kind of see how police departments are sort of taking this very kind of very punitive approach to drug enforcement in small cities. At the same time, those communities are not comfortable with bringing sober houses and medication-assisted treatment to their communities. And so people are having to go very far to get access to resources, oftentimes going to big cities to be able to get it. And so there's this tension between sort of what the needs are of the population and what the sort of existing community that is, not used to these sorts of issues, how they're responding. I mean, I talked to so many people who are like, we don't have a homeless shelter because the residents don't want a homeless shelter. And there's homeless people living, in encampments all over our town because they're refusing to build this infrastructure. And so I think that smaller cities are facing a real demographic change, both in terms of race and socioeconomic status. But I think, there's a really rich and non-trivial literature in the sentencing literature that shows that rural communities are much more harsh in terms of sentencing. And the literature is really focused on the key outcome of the death penalty. And so seeking the death penalty, it's much more likely to get the death penalty if you are being sentenced in a rural community than an urban community. But when I started to dig into this literature, there were some interesting sort of mixed findings. So for example, young adults were actually given harsher sentences in urban districts than in smaller and rural ones. And also women receive more leniency in rural courts than in the urban courts. So there's some interesting sort of mixed results there, but I think that any scholar of sentencing would sort of argue that, there are these political strongholds and prosecutors are elected, and there's a much more of a kind of appetite for harsh punishment in smaller communities on average. And so I think that's maybe part of the persistence that line. So those are some of the ways I've kind of tried to explain across such a large amount of space and diversity of space. Comparing like New Mexico to Philly, like Pennsylvania, it's really hard to come up with a single story that explains all of this. But I think it's a combination of sort of socioeconomic and racial shifts in demography, political sort of shifts, and like kind of political elites in the urban communities taking on the charge of reform, and the persistence of harsh punishment in smaller communities that are not sort of also taking on that charge.
Yvette?
Yeah, Jessica, thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. I learned so much. I had a question. You mentioned that when we think about racial disparities in the criminal system, especially around mass incarceration, that we need to contextualize them and that we need to view them as really cumulative. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that and what you mean, and whether you've been able to see whether the disparities really do build upon each other. And then also you sort of hinted at that these disparities obviously probably arise much earlier than at the point of mass incarceration, and probably even beyond person entering the criminal system, and just sort of, the framework from which you view that, and anything else you can say would be super helpful. Thanks.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, it's a massive empirical challenge, what I'm sort of suggesting. And one of the things I sort of say in my last empirical chapter, chapter 6, is we could, pool all of our data across like 40 different measures and kind of look at something I would call like a punishment vulnerability index, where this community is just so vulnerable to harsh policing and harsh punishment. And we could, think about that like we do a hazards, an environmental hazard measure, where we say, well, this community hasn't yet dealt with climate change in this way, but it will very soon. And so we could respond to it now instead of waiting to see these people and these young children end up in the criminal legal system. So that's sort of one way that we're all working on such important work that, like with this example of prenatal care and decarceration, putting people like that in the same room could be really transformative in how we think about preventing incarceration, later incarcerations. I have worked specifically on looking at sort of disparity across a criminal justice process, but it's a very specific case, which is solitary confinement. And so what I do is I look at, who gets a ticket in prison, and then how is that ticket adjudicated in a hearing, and then whether or not they get a very long sentence in solitary confinement. And it's sort of like a bit of an example of the larger criminal legal system, where you get a ticket from a police officer, there's a court hearing, and then you get a sentence. And we do find that racial disparity accumulates across that process. And also we look at specifically at mental health disparity. But I think what I'm sort of pointing to is these sort of debates about, when we control for something, we no longer see a disparity, or if we look just at these sort of court decisions, there's no racial disparity. And I think, like many scholars, I'm sort of saying, well, but what's happening in that community life that's producing this sort of entry into the criminal justice system, and how could we meaningfully incorporate that into our analysis? Exposure to under-resourced schooling and highly policed schooling, and adverse childhood experiences and prenatal experiences. All of these things kind of lead up to this sort of moment where a person is a cop or police officer is deciding to arrest someone or not. And how could we sort of meaningfully, and not just sort of treat it as a background structure in which we can't do anything about it, how can we meaningfully incorporate that into our analysis? And that's something I'm trying to do by looking at neighborhoods as the sort of first environment in which a person comes into contact with the criminal justice system. So that's a lot of answer. I don't know if it's all that satisfying, but I think your question is really valuable, and kind of where I see my work going next is how do we sort of galvanized that we're all working on something so similar, and yet we treat structure as this sort of background hardship for us to control away, but in reality that's what's driving everything. And so how can we draw that into our analysis?
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that, and I think you've just really made the case for why we have to be investing in these sort of like upstream or downstream, however you think about it, structures like education and many other things, housing, all of the different determinants that actually determine the racial disparities or manifest in the racial disparities later on. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your question.
Jeff?
Yeah, so I have a question on behalf of the Behavioral Health Corps here at the Wilson Center. So there's certainly a parallel pattern and a parallel literature in psychiatric epidemiology and mental health services and policy research around deinstitutionalization. So you go back to the middle of the 20th century and you've got 500,000 people, locked up in these large state mental hospitals. Then you have the first wave of deinstitutionalization. And there's also, as you know, a literature in sociology dating back to the 60s of the critiques of total institutions and a racial disparity argument about these institutions being used as instruments of social control and, Black people having a higher rate of involuntary commitment. And then you have, the failure of the community care system to really rise up and take the place of this. And then flash forward, and we have a mental health system that's kind of fragmented and under-resourced and overburdened, and tons of people with serious disabling mental health conditions who are incarcerated on any given day, probably more than there were in one of the big asylums in the middle of the 20th century. And there's argument I'm sure you're familiar with. One is sort of this kind of hydraulic trans-institutionalization argument that, these people would have been in the asylum, and now here they are in jails, more jails than prisons. And the other is notice that's really an oversimplification. You have, the kind of criminogenic risk factors that overlap with why people have bad outcomes if they have serious mental illnesses and all of that. So I'm wondering if you could comment on what you think is the role of deinstitutionalization in the rise of the carceral state, as you put it, and also what racial disparities might have to do with that. I mean, now you certainly have a few beds left in state mental hospitals, and they tend to be, more people of color there, partly because they're coming from spillover from the justice system, people who are referred for incompetency to stand trial, or forensic beds that are silting up there. So I wonder if you could talk about how these two parallel phenomena may relate to each other or intertwine.
Wow, that is a very big question and a really important one. And I'm going to actually draw a little bit more on my work on solitary confinement, actually. I did a field study with Bruce Western at Columbia, where we interviewed 100 men living in a solitary confinement unit in Pennsylvania and followed up with them 3 months later. And probably one of the biggest sort of striking features that we observed was just the high prevalence of mental health problems and serious mental illness among this population in solitary. And that solitary, of course, is known to exacerbate and perhaps create new mental health issues. And so, I think there's like a really active debate about whether or not there was this like true passage of one institution to the other. And I think that what we can say now is that there is a huge mental health burden among the people who are incarcerated and are experiencing some of the harshest conditions of confinement. And American prisons are, internationally unusual in how harsh they are. And there's very little standards of care within facilities, and people we talk to in solitary, we're not getting access to medications and counseling and things like that because of the nature of these conditions. So I think your question is actually leading to like a really provocative point, which is I'm sort of arguing for a form of deinstitutionalization in my book, and what will happen to all the folks who were once, if we were to sort of take the story as correct, that we deinstitutionalized one system and then all those folks kind of ended up, I would say, in jail, if really not necessarily in prison, but definitely through the jail system. We see that quite well. And all I can say is that deinstitutionalization was not paired with this sort of unprecedented, robust investment in social and healthcare, social welfare and healthcare, and that it was this shift towards community-based care that required, I think, something so profound. And that's what I think abolitionists are calling for, is not let's just deinstitutionalize and call it a day, but that there's a rehabilitative, that these institutions could actually somehow become rehabilitative. And we could look to other systems like in Europe and other sort of community-based, even indigenous justice practices that do better in terms of not creating and reproducing harm. But I hear you that we deinstitutionalized once, and it led to, in some people's view, a new form of total institution that then what's to stop mass imprisonment from going in that direction again. And I think that taking very seriously what it means not just to invest in social services and education and healthcare is not a very satisfying answer. But another paper I just published in PLOS One shows that when we expanded Medicaid through the ACA, we actually saw a reduction in arrests, a significant reduction in arrests, 20% for all arrests and 40% for drug arrests. So it's sort of a small experiment of saying, well, if we expand healthcare access, what happens? Do people actually get removed from the criminal justice system's front door? And so that's to me sort of a small change. That again, you wouldn't necessarily have ACA folks and policing folks in the same room, but the ACA had that impact. And so that's kind of a long and circuitous answer to a very good question about sort of how do we make sense of deinstitutionalization and what happens in a country that we kind of reproduce institutions of control. As one closes, another opens. So it's a great question.
Thank you.
So, Jessica, I have a question. So one of your big findings is that incarceration in rural, urban, small cities, small counties has outpaced incarceration in these large urban metro areas. But we don't really hear much about that going on in those areas. And one of the reasons you suggest is kind of that there's been this changing landscape of media and that there's generally weak media coverage in and of these non-urban areas. And so like the narratives and the personal histories of people living in these non-urban communities aren't always featured into our understanding of mass criminalization or incarceration. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on what the consequences of that are.
Yeah, I think, first of all, there is a massive decline in the local newspaper, and there's, very little interest, scholarly and public, on small cities. I was telling, a scholar, once, we really need students to study these small places. And it's really hard, to say you need to care. Everyone sort of plugs in if I'm studying Chicago, but if I'm studying a tiny little town in Massachusetts, the first question is, well, how is this generalizable? And we don't ask that same question of Chicago, at least not very often. And so I think one of my goals is to share the importance of caring about these smaller places, and not just from a scholarly point of view, but also from a public point of view. And I often point to, in my book, I point to some very high profile cases, for example, the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson and Trayvon Martin in Florida. Both of these individuals were killed in a place that, is so small and so, sort of unremarkable in terms of the sort of social and political discussion places. Oftentimes Michael Brown's associated with St. Louis, but he was, his death happened at the hands of a police department that has nothing to do with St. Louis and has a very different structure and has very different political history. And so caring more about these places is extremely important and kind of a goal of mine, and specifically sort of small cities and suburbs as they become more and more diversified, and kind of these things are starting to interact more explicitly. So yeah, I think it's really important that we care more about these places and tend to not use Chicago or New York or Los Angeles as sort of emblematic of the entire experience of American life, that they're very actually quite unusual, that most people live in actually smaller cities, and that that needs to be kind of at the forefront of community and urban sociology, and maybe also law and criminology.
Thank you. So for our very last question, Jeff.
Yeah, just a follow-up to your answer to the last question. And it's just this. So our group some years ago did a study in Connecticut where we did a data linkage of people in the public behavioral health system, and then we matched them to records in the criminal legal system. And then we tried to look at all these different patterns and actually estimate the cost of care and the cost of incarceration and everything. And I remember having a meeting with the commissioners from these different departments in Connecticut, and the director of the prison mental health system was a psychiatrist who was a progressive guy and was trying to defend what they were doing and claiming that they were, really trying to do the best they could. And they had some advantages because, for example, he says, if we have a patient with schizophrenia, we have fully observed administration of antipsychotic medications, and we don't have to worry that they won't stop taking their medicine and end up living under a bridge. And he was trying to make the argument that maybe it's better for a person to be receiving treatment in a humane system in prison rather than living, homeless or in some worse condition. And then the director of the DOC said, but they're in prison. Prison's a terrible place to be for a sick person. So it was an interesting argument, though, apropos of deinstitutionalization to nothing versus having something less restrictive. But apropos of the racial disparity question, I just wanted to make the point that a difference is only a disparity if the outcome is a bad thing. I mean, if you think of the difference as coercion, that's a disparity. If you think of it as access to care or access to a good or something like that, then it might be defined. That's a provocative thing to say, but it is easier to make that argument with regard to civil commitment than it is in, access to mental health care through incarceration. But I was just reminded of that conversation in your answer, and thinking of rather than just deinstitutionalization as a complete, shut it down versus then what, which I think is the interesting follow-on question.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're over time, but I want to just quickly respond, which is to say, I've spent a lot of time in prisons and doing a lot of field work in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. And my sense is that it says a lot more about the quality of life for people living at the extreme margins in the community that we would even ever say that prison is the right environment to provide care for individuals. And I mean, I've heard similar arguments about, well, you actually get healthcare in prison, whereas you don't in the community. And so people, get chronic conditions treated and mental health care, mental health problems treated. And prisons in America are incredibly harsh, Spartan, and harmful, and people are exposed to violence, infectious disease, develop all sorts of hypervigilance and mental health issues that follow it, are removed, their liberty is taken away, and prisons are not meant for punishment. They're not meant to, create and enact punishment. And many people would describe them as being punishing themselves, and in a variety of ways that emanate into not just their lives, but their families' lives. And so I would, I think that it says a lot more about what we need to do in the community, and then to lean on our prisons as a place of care. That's sort of my experience of the institution. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for asking great questions. And thank you again, Jessica, for taking the time.
Thank you for having me. It was such a pleasure. I really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you very much.